So if this morning's reading of the Hebrew people out in the desert complaining that they don't have enough water sounds a lot like last week's reading about the Hebrew people out in the desert complaining that they don't have anything to eat, it's because it's kind of the same story. They complained a lot, those recently freed Hebrew slaves, and Egypt looked awfully good from a distance. It didn't look as good up close, right? It feels like deja vu, and I think it really felt like deja vu to Moses, who goes to God and says, what do you want me to do with these people? Like even though they're his people, like these people. In our house, it's, your dog is acting oddly, right? And again, deja vu, God satisfies their need, gives them water out of the rock, just like God gave them quail and manna from heaven. God hears and answers their cries.
The rabbis in the Jewish tradition say that every story from Scripture is like a faceted jewel. It can be read from many different perspectives, and each time you move it and read it differently, it gives off a different flash of wisdom and knowledge. And that's certainly the case in the book of Exodus. It can be read on different levels. At one level, this story is about how fickle and shifting human nature can be. Pleading one moment, complaining the next moment. One moment the Hebrew slaves trust God's promise enough to pack their bags and share in the first Passover meal. But once they find themselves in the wilderness, well, they get hungry and they get thirsty and they doubt that God is there at all. These Hebrews have gone from being enslaved in Egypt to being delivered to freedom on their way to the promised land, but they don't exactly know what to do with all this freedom. And getting through the desert is scary. The wilderness of the in-between, not Egypt, not the promised land, is a rough place, and it doesn't always bring out our best. Can you relate?
And then another facet of this story is God's steadfast faithfulness again and again through it all. God hears the people's cries. God brings them out of slavery. God brings them across the Red Sea, the Sea of Reeds. God brings them into the wilderness of freedom. God feeds them when they're hungry. God gives them water when they're thirsty. Like a patient parent, God each time meets them where they are and gives them what they need, no matter how they are. Unsteady people and a steady God. That's one of the themes of these readings. And that's a story I can relate to. Try best I can. I am not always the steady and wise and graceful presence that I would like to imagine myself to be. Just ask the person I live with. In the end, it's God who's steady, not me. I love these words from Brother Thomas Merton when he writes, I am content that this prayer shows me to be what I am, noisy, full of the racket of my imperfections and passions, and the wide open wounds left by my sins, full of my own emptiness, Merton writes. Yet, ruined as my house is, he continues, you live here.
That last line just stays with me.
Yeah.
Ruined as my house is, you live there. That's also a collective reality. Ruined as our house is, God lives here. Whatever size house you're talking about, in your own household, this community of faith, our larger community of Boston and Cambridge, our nation, our world, all creation, God is present despite the mess. And that's the message from Paul's letter to the church at Philippi as well, the letter we call Philippians in the New Testament. That Jesus, the incarnation of God, came to live among us as a human, right into the middle of our ruined houses. Paul, according to scholars, is using an early Christian hymn, perhaps the first Christian hymn, with pretty sophisticated theology already, to describe this incredible process of Jesus coming among us. A key word in the hymn that I shared with Harmony earlier is that Paul uses here is kenosis. And kenosis means to be poured out or to be emptied. And it describes how Christ willed to be emptied of divinity and to be poured into human form. Paul says, taking the form of a slave, willingly living and loving and teaching among us and going to any lengths necessary to connect with us, including going to death. Paul reiterates, death on a cross, the most shameful thing there was. Jesus is God poured out for us, poured into us. Holy water in imperfect vessels to show us God's great and steady love for us. In the words of a Charles Wesley hymn, Jesus emptied himself of all but love.
That's hard for me to believe some days. Hard for you to believe some days, too. The days that I am especially aware that I'm full of the racket of my imperfections, as Tom Merton said. It's sort of a happy happenstance that our choir anthem this morning is from George Herbert's poem, which wrestles with the same thing. When the poet says, I'm unkind, I'm ungrateful, I've taken these eyes that you have made, Lord, and I have marred them. Let me go away because I do not deserve you. And over and over and over again, love, God says, you must sit down and taste my meat. Let me feed you. Let me love you. Let me fill you up with all that I am. All that I have.
We may be unsteady. God is steadfast. That is God's great story. It's the story of Exodus. It's the story of Jesus. God comes to us in our unsteadiness with a steadfast, unending, poured out love. That is God's great story. It's the story also of your life and of mine. It's what brings us, that story is what brings us together. Retelling that story among each other is what brings us together this morning and every morning. And that's why this fall we've been taking a deep dive into the Exodus story. 7 weeks in Exodus. And we could spend a lot more than that if y'all want. We started with the Hebrews in slavery in Egypt, with the stories of the Hebrew or Egyptian midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, those feisty midwives who refused Pharaoh's command to kill the Hebrew baby boys. History's first civil disobedience.
And then we read about Moses' call from God in the burning bush and how Moses turns his life upside down to do what God asked, even though it seems crazy, to go to Pharaoh and ask for those slaves to be freed.
We explored the story of Pesach, the first Passover, where the still enslaved Hebrews put lamb's blood on their doorways, declaring themselves to be God's people.
And then we celebrated that miraculous journey of the Hebrew slaves through the Red Sea, through the Sea of Reeds into freedom, even as we also acknowledged the death of the Egyptian soldiers who were following them.
I love in the Passover Seder tradition that drops of wine are dropped in mourning of the Egyptians, even though they were enemy, even though they were sadistic, even though they were genocidal. God and we mourn that loss. And now in the last week we've seen God, and this week God provide food and poured out water to the hungry and the thirsty and the kind of whiny Israelites in the wilderness, meeting their daily needs with daily bread.
And next Sunday, we'll culminate with the Ten Commandments, which is God's instructions on how it is to live in right relationship with each other and the world and God, how to live well as free people in the world. Ultimately, the Hebrew folk will get to the promised land, where they will begin to live as the people that God has dreamed for them to be.
So, it's an amazing story, this Exodus story. We've spent all this time in Exodus because we consider this story, from slavery to freedom to promised land, to be the archetypal story of how God relates to humanity, of God's nature, of God's love, and our response to it. It's a glorious and really honest tale of both heroism and glory, and of whining and backsliding on the people's part. And it's also a glorious and incredibly honest tale of the steadfast presence of God, of God's love, God's salvation, through all of it. God pouring God's self out into these Hebrew people and into us.
So when you came to worship this morning, you should have gotten an extra handout that has those pieces of the Exodus story on it. If you don't, Lane's got them in the back, and if you put a hand up, Lane, you can run those around, but I think we're good. On the back of that paper is 2 Post-it notes. And here's what we would like you to do with them, because this isn't just the story of the Hebrews. This isn't just God's story. It's our story too. And so we want to invite you to reflect for a moment. Where do you find your personal story reflected somewhere in this story of the Hebrew people to freedom? Where has God freed you from what enslaves you? Where has God met your need, whiny though you might have been at the time? Where has God's love been poured into you again and again, even when you didn't think that you deserved it? Think of a time or two of that. And then later in the service, when you come up for communion, we invite you all to sort of all come up around this side of the sanctuary, and we've got a timeline on the wall of the sanctuary that starts with slavery and ends in the promised land. And take 1 or 2 of your Post-it notes and put it on that place where your story connects into that story. You can see some of the Post-it notes from the 9 o'clock folk this morning. Where does God's story of liberation and freedom tie into your story as a human being?
You can write something on the Post-its if you wish, if you have a writing instrument with you, or you can simply place them empty on the timeline to show the larger themes of where your story and God's story connect. It's is a way to acknowledge your own story and how you connect that to the story of God. If you are like me and Barb,
and Thomas Merton,
and
for that
Thomas
matter.
Merton, you may feel yourself to be a ruined house, noisy, full of the racket of imperfections and passions and wide open wounds. We each are full of cracks. Our world is full of cracks, and each of us has stories of brokenness in our lives. As Leonard Cohen said in Anthem, everything is broken. That's how the light gets in. That's exactly where God's love pours into you, washing you clean, healing you, and making you new. God's love has been here. God's love is here, and God's love will be here for you no matter what. That's grace. That's God's steadfast love.
We see it in the story of Exodus. We experience it in the story of Jesus. And in just a few minutes, when we celebrate the Lord's Supper, when we celebrate communion together, again, we're entering into God's great story. It's your story, our story too.